God's grace found me in divorce care when I didn't think I needed to go, but I did, and it helped me face that I really need God's help.
God's grace found me when, as a result of working the 12 steps of recovery, the compulsion to use was finally lifted.
God's grace found me after I reached out to my dad after 35 years. He wasn't available for most of my life. When I did that, I realized the power of forgiveness.
God's grace found me when I was kind of worrying about stuff. I was driving my car. I didn't know what to do. I actually just stopped and I prayed and I said, God, it's in your hands.
God's grace found me when I was in desperation, fear, loneliness, during multiple separations, infidelity, and now divorce.
God's grace found me sitting in a church pew with mushrooms to the point that for the first time I accepted Jesus as my Savior.
God's grace found me walking down the aisle on my wedding day, and I felt so much love from everyone around me and from God above.
God's grace found me when we found out on Tuesday that our third child, a baby girl who's born in September, will have a healthy heart. Our first two kids, Cody's 6 and Mason's 2, and they're both born with heart problems and had to have surgery immediately at birth.
6 years ago, my wife, my loving wife here, had a ruptured brain aneurysm, and she almost died on me. I was praying and arguing with God daily. That's when I found God.
God's grace found me when I was 9 years old in Mrs. Van Gilder's Sunday school class.
God's grace found me in youth group and in small group. They both provided me with people and tools to help me in times that I wasn't prepared for.
God's grace found me after my 4th divorce when I hit rock bottom. And His grace found me in the church when I hit the doors, in the pews every Sunday, and daily as I read the Bible.
God's grace found me a number of years ago when I was a young high school football coach. A local minister met me and said, "Hey coach, you know, I come to all your games on Friday night. How about you come to mine on Sunday morning and learn about a victory in Jesus?"
God's grace found me when I got involved in the church's marriage ministry. And I learned that as long as I keep God at the center, my life and my marriage can go from good to awesome.
God's grace found me when I was about 14 years old. And as a result of some new friends and youth group leaders, I began my walk with Jesus.
God's grace found me first as a young child attending church with my family, but really, it finds me every day.
God's grace found me when I was a police officer in Washington, D.C. On 9/11, and standing on the bridge going into Virginia when the plane flew over my head and eventually crashed into the Pentagon. Within 5 minutes I was in the turmoil, but in all the mess and all the death and the smells, God was leading me.
God's grace found me when I was a very young child in my parents' living room when my pastor father shared Jesus' love with me.
God's grace found me more than once in my life. As a child through my parents and then bringing me to church, but it really found me when I was a young adult after I'd made some rather poor choices and I realized that He still loved me.
God's grace found me in a hospice room where my father was. It wasn't until I came here to Grace Church and I was asked a question, "Do you love me?" And I checked off the yes box.
God's grace found me.
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 God's grace found me.